If you're like me, you probably gain some sense of comfort when looking at an ingredient list like this. It gives me clarity on what I'm about to consume, and even when I don't recognize a particular ingredient, I can rest assured that it's been rigorously tested, that all of these ingredients are safe. Well, that's what I used to think. In the US, ingredients of questionable safety end up in our food supply constantly, thanks to a legal loophole. Just look at what happened in 2022.
I started having extreme stomach and gastro pain and went to the hospital. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. I had elevated liver levels.
I spent 26 hours in the ER, ended up getting an MRCP, which is like a special MRI scan. I had jaundice of the skin. They freaking took my gallbladder out.
In June of 2022, many connected the dots of their mysterious illnesses through a Reddit post made by user Han2466 titled "Extreme Stomach Pain Sickness from Lentil and Leek Crumbles." These crumbles that resulted in numerous emergency room visits were a product of Daily Harvest, a popular meal delivery service.
I had an organ removed.
Doctors were baffled. So was Daily Harvest, for that matter. Was this a salmonella outbreak? Were pesticides present?
I have numbness in my fingers. I have some vision changes, so we really don't know how long it'll last.
A single listed ingredient was pinpointed as the cause of this mass poisoning, an ingredient the FDA would later deem an unapproved food additive. And how this ingredient wound up in Daily Harvest's recipe will infuriate you.
The system is rigged towards ignorance.
In June, Daily Harvest issued a recall of its lentil and leek crumbles. And by July, the company was able to single out an ingredient called Terra flour. Terra flour comes from the seeds of the Terra plant. We use other parts of the Terra plant without such dramatic results, but for whatever reason, processing flour from the seeds is an express ticket to the emergency room. Terra flour made it into the Daily Harvest recipe because it was labeled by the industry as generally recognized as safe, or GRAS.
In 1958, Congress passed this law called the Food Additives Amendment, and it basically broke up ingredients into two categories.
The first category is food additives. Think artificial flavors that the FDA has to explicitly approve. The second is this generally recognized as safe, or GRAS category.
The idea was to allow ingredients that were already in the food supply to remain in the food supply, salt, pepper, things like that, and not have to have companies prove their safety.
GRAS substances can be novel substances found in the environment, processed foods. They can also be entirely synthetic chemicals. That's part of the problem.
Through this GRAS categorization, companies don't need FDA approval to put basic, time-tested ingredients like garlic into their jarred tomato sauce, for instance.
As part of the definition of food additives, a company has to go through a rigorous review, FDA approval, and the chemical is approved in its regulations. When companies found that that was too burdensome, they noticed that in the statute there was an exemption if a chemical was considered generally recognized as safe. And they decided, really starting in the 1990s, that they could make those decisions without ever telling FDA.
Terra flour was allowed in things like smoothies and leek crumbles through this GRAS exemption. And as terrible as 39 people having to get their gallbladders removed is, it's maybe one of the least concerning things I learned about GRAS ingredients. When a company wants to add some new GRAS ingredient to their product, whether that be Terra flour or something made in the lab, the FDA allows companies to determine, independently, if it's safe. That's it. The FDA requires companies to provide tangible data to prove these ingredients are safe.
There has to be something published. However, publication, companies can put it on their website and count that as publication.
To be clear, this data needs to be published, but not through any kind of publication that employs peer review. This data and safety determination ultimately gets reviewed by what's called a GRAS panel, but it's not as independent as it sounds.
The research has shown that 100% of the GRAS panels are people with conflicts of interest, financial conflicts of interest.
100%.
100%.
There's not one person.
There was not one person.
The guy who did that research? Tom Neltner.
What we found is that 7 individuals served on 46% of those panels. Their whole career is deciding that something is or is not grass. What we know is that the scientists that ask the tough questions, the scientists who are critical of the process, they don't get asked to be serving on expert panels because the system is biased to give the company the answers it wants.
Companies might want to use new, non-FDA vetted ingredients because they'll make their product taste good, like trans fats, or because it's a cheaper alternative to an existing ingredient. Or maybe it stops your peanut butter from getting that unsightly layer of oil on top. And the easiest way to get those ingredients into new food formulations is through the GRAS loophole.
Do we know how many items are entering the food supply like that?
We don't know. One study found decades ago that 1,000 chemicals entered the food supply over a 20-year period.
Okay, so that's one route. Now you told me there's another route. There's a tell the FDA version of this story?
There's a tell the FDA version of the story.
That other version, Jennifer tells me, is when companies still conduct their own studies. But they ask the FDA to review them. They do this because an FDA stamp of approval gives their product extra credibility, which honestly sounds great.
The FDA then can either say, we don't question the safety determination, go ahead and use it, or they can say, actually, we don't agree with your conclusion, and they ask for more data. Here's where the problem is. The company can then just say, you know what, cease and desist, we don't want you to keep reviewing this, and then they could go to market anyway.
I want to pause this to make this clear. The FDA can say, whoa, 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 your numbers are wrong, your product might make people sick, and the company can say, whatever. Pretend this never happened, and we're gonna sell it anyway.
About 1 in every 6 gets pulled back by the company because they don't want to get a letter that says, this is not grass.
You as a researcher, are you able to look at ingredient list and have the tools to determine if this is one of those ingredients that the FDA looked at and said was not safe or was never submitted to the FDA at all?
No, no one has that tool. So the food labels do not help us in this question.
Terra flour is a dramatic example, and relative to other additives, easy to catch. A bunch of young people with liver problems ending up in the ER gets noticed fast. But the thing that really frightens me is when an ingredient's harmful effect could take years to discover. Trans fats, those were grass.
Paper after paper found increased heart disease risk from this industrial trans fat, and then 30 years later, the FDA said, you know what, you're right, industrial trans fat should be removed from the food supply, and only in 2023 was it actually finally removed.
So what happens is once these things get into our food supply, we wait for the evidence to be overwhelming. I think the number was 26,000 people a year were dying from those trans fats.
Tom tells me the FDA does have the explicit authority to monitor the health effects of ingredients as we're exposed to them over time. Ingredients that could cause cancer or other issues, but only after years of exposure. The FDA just doesn't exercise that authority.
The system is rigged towards ignorance. You do just enough to be able to determine that it's safe. Just enough to get it through FDA review. Just enough to have a hand-picked team of experts that you picked, that you pay, who will agree with you.
As for Terra flour, the FDA revoked its GRAS status, but it took them 2 years to do it.
They still can't say that Terra flour is the problem, but they can say that Terra flour has not been shown to be safe and shouldn't be used in food.
Through my conversations with experts like Jennifer and Tom, I've become consistently baffled as to why the FDA hasn't done more to vet the safety of ingredients before or even after they end up in our kitchens. Their job is literally to ensure the safety of our food supply.
Any sense of why they're not doing more of this?
It's very hard to answer the question of why FDA You know, there were safety determinations made under Nixon. The FDA did not adopt. They were independent safety evaluations. BVO took 53 years. Trans fat took 30 years. The food industry polices itself in America, and I think this grass loophole is a perfect example of that.
There are lots of well-documented examples of corrupt corporate influence dictating America's food policies. That's what I was looking for in this story. And to be honest, I found no smoking gun, no good explanation why the FDA is like this. Experts I talked to did agree that the FDA is slow and more likely to react to something the public is already up in arms about, rather than being proactive in exercising its authority. They also lack budget and resources. But it doesn't need to be this way, and in fact, isn't this way in other countries.
In the aughts, around 2000 to 2010, Europe said, we're going to go back and look at all of the existing substances. So we're not going to just assume that because it was safe in 1960, based on what we knew then, that it's still safe. And as a result, they pulled many, many substances, many flavors, many things out of the food supply. It's one of the reasons why people think it may be healthier in Europe. Nobody has the grass loophole like we have. It's a weakness in our system that undermines the credibility of our food. It undermines our health.
Our food system is under increasing scrutiny from both political parties. Bernie Sanders grilled the FDA on why they haven't done more to protect Americans.
I'm not going to castigate the people that work in the food and beverage industry.
You're not.
No, what I will
That is
say-
your job.
RFK Jr., Trump's pick to lead Health and Human Services, has made food safety a priority.
Most importantly, we need to deploy NIH and FDA to doing the research to understand the relationship between these different food additives and chronic disease.
There is one bill that could fix a small part of the problem. A start.
The Toxic Free Food Act was introduced in the House with a companion in the Senate that was trying to make sure that we fix the system. Two aspects in particular. One is that we deal with the grass loophole and to try to close it down, to make sure those chemicals get reviewed. The second one is to look back at existing chemicals. Look back to chemicals that were approved or allowed in food decades ago to push FDA to figure out these existing chemicals. Are they really safe?
It shouldn't be on Reddit users to figure out what's safe to eat. A consumer shouldn't wind up on an operating table because they thought they were eating lentils and leeks. Without proper FDA oversight, we become test dummies, susceptible to whatever malady or unpleasant side effect that slips through the approval chain. It's about time the US government stops viewing our food supply as an afterthought. Stop making it easy for corporations to poison us. Thank you so much for watching our video. If you have any ideas or pitches of what we should cover next, leave them in the comments. And be sure to like and subscribe to get more Perfect Union in your feed.